Over the past weekend, the United States and self-appointed leader of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, attempted a spectacle. Using humanitarian aid as a pretense, the U.S. attempted to break through the border into Venezuela. These attempts were rebuffed. If the U.S. wanted to relieve Venezuela, it would eliminate sanctions and send its aid through the UN or the Red Cross or other reputable aid agencies. And in fact, the politicization and spectacle of aid is another incredibly damaging effect of U.S. foreign policy on the Venezuelan people, as well as, of course, some of the abuses and crackdown by the Maduro government from some of the protesters as well. And again, let's reset here by being real about the whole situation, but also getting back to some extremely basic principles that so many are working so hard for us to not understand here. But before we get to that, let's get to this. This is Donald Trump, who I think is actually, in his own bizarre and grotesque way here, being very honest, which is that there is a crisis of legitimacy in the United States, in the whole Western world. And I say Western not really as a geography, but almost as a mind space. Capitalism is in question. There's a profound cynicism about the oligarchies and inequalities that define our lives. In fact, the same policies that have been exported and demanded by Western governments, the United States, and multinational corporations and institutions like the World Bank and IMF that have locked into place austerity, inequality, and abuse in places, across Latin America, Africa, and so on. They've migrated home. That's been one of the great stories. Of course, this began in the Reagan-Thatcher era, but it's significantly increased, and that's part of the map of the world you see today. So Donald Trump, whose economic populism scam is basically done, is out doubling down on white nationalism and racism with the border wall, but now he's bringing back the 80s religion of red baiting in an attempt to not only take his presidency out of the dumps, which, again, let's face it, this presidency has never had a 50% approval rating. That's very bad. That's pathetic. What he wants, and is joined by the elites of the Washington Consensus, U.S. corporate interests, and all the other usual suspects, is not only a distraction and an imposition of a new Condor years in Latin America, but a reaffirmation of order. Here he is in Miami.
Socialism promises prosperity, but it delivers poverty. Socialism promises unity, but it delivers hatred and it delivers division. Socialism promises a better future, but it always returns to the darkest chapters of the past. That never fails. It always happens. Socialism is a sad and discredited ideology rooted in the total ignorance of history and human nature, which is why socialism eventually must always give rise to tyranny, which it does.
Now, of course, socialism is actually a rising, profoundly important, and dynamic ideology which has contributed to U.S. history in the form of the labor union movements. If you go back even, of course, to the deepest eras of the apartheid in the American South, American communists were at the forefront of organizing against it. And of course, all of the examples that we know from Scandinavian and other countries in the Eurozone that have produced basic, obvious human outcomes like universal health care as examples of socialism. But then we go into the developing world. And this is the paradox and the problem with the conversation around Venezuela, which is that on one hand, of course, there's internal failings in the Venezuelan government. But then on the other hand, anytime you've had a government such as Hugo Chavez's Bolivarian government or Michael Manley's government in Jamaica in the 1970s is two of endless examples, essentially attempting to replicate not Cuban-style socialism, but really something more analogous to the New Deal or social democracy in Western Europe. they have been ruthlessly undermined by U.S. intelligence agencies, sanctions, disruption, and abuse at every single step of the way. So that is the pattern here. And now let's acknowledge it. There's been mismanagement in the Venezuelan economy. There was never a pivot to oil. So as the commodity prices went down, this has had a huge effect on what Venezuela has been able to do. And in fact, the reliance on a commodity boom and making a sort of pact with capital in that form and environmentally extractive industries has been a problem for all of the pink tide center-left and left governments in Latin America. There has been no response in working on things like the exchange rate, which Greg Wilpert, who is a very important analyst at The Real News and a founder of Telesur, has pointed out was essential in order to rein in things like corruption and capital flight. And the Maduro government has absolutely responded harshly and committed abuses. We can be real about this. That is objective reality. It does not mean that they're not also anticipating and responding at times to profoundly real threats. So when John Oliver rolled his eyes last year about Maduro suggesting that the United States wanted to assassinate him and that there was an interest in a coup, well, in addition to all of the events that were unfolding then with Mike Pompeo musing about it as the then head of the CIA, we now have Marco Rubio getting pretty overt about the sociopathic designs of U.S. foreign policy in Venezuela. Just a picture, a before and after of Muammar Gaddafi, who was, of course, after being, and of course, no love for Gaddafi at all, obviously, after he was removed from power in a UN-sanctioned but violated airstrikes because they went far beyond the UN mandate, he was sodomized and murdered in the street. Marco Rubio is suggesting publicly that this is a model for Venezuela. Chavismo represented people taking control of their own lives. There's no doubt about that. It was a new experiment in radical democracy, and there were real achievements in workers' rights, rights for women, Afro-Indigenous people, a brilliant constitution, as well as redistribution and poverty relief, particularly in years of the oil boom. And some of these networks have been maintained under Maduro, which is why even those who have been sidelined and oppressed under the Maduro government inside the Bolivarian movement, of course, are lending critical support now in opposition to the coup. We know that there needs to be a democratic diplomatic process that averts a catastrophe here. Everybody knows that besides the coup mongers. The United States is now aligning itself with a new right-wing circle in Latin America. Of course, Jair Bolsonaro's fascist regime in Brazil, in Colombia, in Argentina under Macri, and in Chile. And so if you go back and think about the Condor years of the 1970s and 80s, this was a campaign of state terror that, quote-unquote, fought socialism with the full backing of the entire foreign policy apparatus of the United States. Over 60,000 people were murdered and disappeared. Salvador Allende was ousted from power. Democratic governments across the region were ousted from power with the active backing of the State Department, the CIA, and of course in Central America in the 80s, you saw some of the most horrific atrocities imaginable, backed by, of course, Elliot Abrams, the Trump administration's point person in Venezuela. In Colombia, Iván Duque Marquez ran a campaign much like Bolsonaro that painted his opponent as aligned with Chavez, the FARC, and a supporter of feminism. And he has attempted to undermine his predecessors, who was a center-right leader, his peace pact with the FARC that was moving Colombia forward. In Brazil, Bolsonaro, of course, has praised the military dictatorship and is openly taking aim at the indigenous people, labor unions, and many others. The political imprisonment of Lula da Silva was an essential step, as Lula and the PT was a counterbalance as the largest country in Brazil and the region to U.S. hegemony. And Lula's latest letter from prison again has restated that Brazil cannot be a servant to the United States in this fashion. The recently elected president of Paraguay, Mario Abado Benitez, is connected to that country's former dictatorship as well. And now Chile and Argentina both have resurgent right-wing governments. We need to be clear that what is happening in Latin America is a return to those Condor years. And we don't need to, we can make meaningful distinctions. The Workers' Party in Brazil had many important, vital successes. Lula was a unique and exceptional leader. Chavez was a great leader. They both had serious failings in different regards. Maduro and Ortega in Nicaragua, we could probably pretty roundly and systemically criticize. However, we have to recognize that in this context, they are the target of a far-right counter-reversal in the region, which will only lead to outcomes far worse than what they provide. And that is where the sort of simplicity actually emerges on some level now, which is that this must be opposed. We need the analysis that sees all variables and is intellectually honest and rigorous, but the effort to reimpose in the most blunt, violent, and grotesque means possible to work out the insecurities of oligarchs inside North America and reassert that domination in such a raw form needs to be opposed actively and categorically, full stop. Guys, we are running a little tight, but do you have anything to add?
I just want to add two quick
please.
things. One is that I think it's really important to recognize, because a lot of Americans have a difficult time when they're talking about what's going on in other countries, is forgetting that, you know, there is a national bourgeoisie in Brazil, in Chile,
Absolutely.
in Colombia, and in Venezuela that has been very threatened by Chavez. And it's important to recognize that those alliances, right, exist without necessarily like the United States imperial interests. They benefit greatly from them, and that's why they're using them today.
Right.
And the second point I want to make is, you know, we should be worried about the new consensus that we've been seeing in the media when we're talking about support for the Maduro regime. We see these graphics, these infographics all the time, and they say, look, these are the countries that support Maduro, and these are the countries that oppose him. And it's very clear that there is a white European
100%.
coalition that is trying to take out Maduro.
And every time you see in social media, just to be blunt, you know, if you do a video on how Lula is a political prisoner, or how, of course, you know, I think we've staked actually a very obvious and broad-based and smart position on Venezuela that includes necessary critiques of Maduro, but the bottom line is an opposition to coup support. You will get flooded with comments from people from these countries. And that's fine, and I respect it. And if the perspective is legitimate, I'll hear it. But, you know, bear in mind that the class basis alone of who you're going to interact with, by and large, on social media. I talked to a contact I work with in Brazil. It's like, look, you know, your average Workers' Party's base is not sitting on their iPhone in, you know, some nice high rise in a prominent city in Brazil, arguing with gringos on Twitter. Those who are part of this far right emergence. And, you know, that's the bottom line.
As regards to what this means for Bernie, you know, I've been thinking about, it's been since, I think, Truman, since a president has called for the CIA to be abolished. And I think Kennedy, privately, he said, I wanted to break it into 1,000 pieces and scatter to the winds. I've dismissed a lot of the Bernie Russia stuff. I think it's nonsense. Like, I don't like Tad Devine, that whole subplot. I think it's silly
bullshit. It's just about political consultants being sleazy.
But I also know that, like, when Bernie talks about military intervention, it's kind of a way around saying these covert operations that we've always done, right?
That's right.
And I don't think Bernie can fight that fight. Right, because there's no abolish CIA. There is abolish ICE, but
there should be a hashtag abolish CIA.
There should be, but there's not really anything there for him to launch pad off.
Right.
So it's just it's a strategic. I think it's hard for him because he can't. Because I think you are going to have, especially when you have this like resistant CIA lovers, right? Like I'm just curious how that's going to play out, and I think that might explain some of his tentativeness.
And it's also just and just regards to this, resistant CIA lovers thing. I mean, first, just two other really quick points because I think it's really important. Let's go back to Iraq for a second, where I think a lot of people who were in their late 20s through 30s kind of cut their political teeth one way or another. There was no complexity about the Saddam Hussein regime, okay? That was a hideous, brutal, murderous, genocidal, actually. You can apply that word to it. Opposing that invasion was beyond the right call in every way, shape, and form. Politically, morally, everybody knows if you're still supporting the invasion of Iraq, I don't know, you're Tony Blair or George W. Bush or just some total crackpot or somebody that, can wash their hands with it because it doesn't matter to you because it didn't kill and displace your family or, blow off your son's leg as a soldier or your daughter's leg, right? So there is a part of this where I love the instinct to try to figure out how do we actually solve these problems? Who do we want to support? How do we, figure it out? That's great. But there's a very problematic American attitude where, like, the condescension and supposed obligations of empire get transferred to your Twitter account. And there is a way in which it's like, guys, you know what? Sometimes things are really complicated. I would encourage you to, of course, people like us and others, try to do, read and think about as much as you can. But sometimes you just have to go with the simple takeaway. That is no coup, no invasion, period. Full stop. And the second point with regards to these resistance types, look, it's one thing that they don't have a structural understanding of U.S. foreign policy and intelligence services. That's a huge problem, but a lot of people don't. And that's a failure of many different things that we have to work to rectify. But by their own logic, let's do it. The fact that you're going to run around rightly calling Donald Trump an inhumane racist who cages children, who has zero regards for, he's deporting plenty of Venezuelans. There you go. Those Venezuelans have absolutely fled the country for a variety of reasons, including the failures of its own government. And if one is so concerned, why would you deport them back there? Just as so the notion that you would correctly say that this is an administration of racist, immoral buffoons, but then also say, but we should probably, give them and their 1980s death squad PR man a fair shake on potentially one of the most aggressive and catastrophic things one could possibly do in the hemisphere is breathtakingly stupid. And I hope that people will, I don't know, smell the coffee on that, do some reading, get out of your head. It's really okay to hold simultaneous, thoughts at once, but also hold to some very clear principles. And some like, don't intervene in Latin America, don't back coups. And yes, Donald Trump is a disgusting racist and does not care about the well-being of anybody in any of these places. Full stop.
And if they cared about Venezuela, they would lift the sanctions. And that's
precisely
the first thing you should
There
do.
you go. Yeah. There you go. You want to help the Venezuelan people? Lift the sanctions. You just enjoyed that Michael Brooks Show video, and you can get a lot more by subscribing to us here at the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. It's literally right there.